Hello everyone, and welcome to our 13th weekly segment. We're going to be taking a look at the war in Ukraine. This is January 2nd of 2023. There has been continuing shelling across the entire front, mostly focused in the Donbass. Heavy fighting continues in the Donbass as well, most notably around Soledar and Bakhmut. There have been recent air raids on Kiev and Dnipro, and Kiev and Odessa are still recovering from air raids earlier in the week that knocked out large sections of the power. Same thing applies to Lviv. A decision has also been made by the Russian government regarding the Western price cap on fossil fuel sales. Russia will no longer sell oil to countries that are deciding prices on the basis of the price cap, although it is worth noting this decree will not take effect until February, and it's scheduled to end in July. And now to switch gears a little bit, we're going to talk about Putin's New Year's address for 2022. The quick version is that in many ways it differs from his previous New Year's addresses, but there's nothing substantially different from the things that he's been saying for most of this year. The first symbolic difference that a lot of people have rightly jumped on is the background. In this video, Putin is standing in front of several Russian soldiers, or more likely performers playing Russian soldiers. That's been a common theme in media events with the Putin government recently, and particularly Putin specifically. You may have seen the articles about a group of mothers of soldiers that he met with recently that turned out to be completely fake. So that's one notable divergence, which is fairly representative, I feel, of the rest of the speech, which strikes a very aggressive, combative tone and focuses almost exclusively on foreign policy. Where it deviates, it's about things that are affected by foreign policy. There's very little here that you won't have heard if you've been listening to Lavrov or Peskov or even Putin throughout the year. Everyone's out to get us. This was a preemptive war. NATO was going to attack first. The government in Ukraine would fall if only the West wasn't supporting it. It would fall apart on its own, not it would fall to Russia, because it is, in their view, not a real or legitimate government. Where it wasn't talking about foreign policy, the key focus was on sacrifices made for the sake of foreign policy and thanking the Russian people for those sacrifices, justifying them, explaining why they would be necessary, and why more sacrifices in the future might be necessary. I'm only going to mention 2 quotes from it. In theory, I could quote about half of it, and there's probably a lot of things worth saying about most of that. But at that point, you can just go and find it on the Kremlin website. There's an English translation. So quote 1. It was a year of difficult but necessary decisions, of important steps towards Russia's full sovereignty and a powerful consolidation of our society. So the important part is there, because we've heard that it's a difficult choices, difficult steps, around Kherson, and recently, a few months ago, Putin said it himself. So what really matters there is the phrase true sovereignty. So this is something that we've talked about before that's very common in the Russian nationalist intellect that we have been discussing, and this is kind of open confirmation from Putin that this is one of his driving things, that Russia cannot be complete and cannot be fully itself without Ukraine. Now, quote 2, which again, I think is fairly not new, but it doesn't really seep into the cultural consciousness here yet, and it hasn't been said this clearly, this publicly in a while, so I think it's worth mentioning. It was a year of truly pivotal, even fateful events. They became the frontier where we lay the foundations for our common future, our true independence. So again, true independence, flash forward to the sovereignty thing, flashback, sovereignty thing. There is no independent, true Russia without Ukraine. The important thing, fateful events, fateful. There are a few other phrases like this, but I think this is the most prominent one. Now, we see in some of the phrases he uses an almost semi-mystical view of Russian civilization in general and this war in specific. And we've seen aspects of this also in the focus on history that has been used in the narrative of this war that Putin has used. He focuses a lot on the Rus, which is what Russia claims is the ancestry of its civilization, and the prince who converted the Rus to Orthodox Christianity in Kiev. And specifically, it's worth noting that the Russian name of this prince is Vladimir, Vladimir the Great. And I think with this war, we're seeing almost a coming together of Putin's, in a way, deifying of the Russian state and the Russian civilization as he sees it, and his association of himself with Russia and the leader with the country. We've touched on this briefly before in general when we talked about the nuclear risk that we are looking at right now and why, although Putin is a rational actor, he is not rational in the way that most of us would conceive it upon hearing that word. That is to say, he is consistently following his own goals and pursuing his interests as he understands them, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's doing a good job of it, or that his interests and goals are consistent with external reality, which I'm sure isn't particularly reassuring when the topic at hand is the risk of nuclear war, but there we go. There is one other thing that I want to talk about. There is a Russian journalism outlet called Meduza, which claims to have gotten access to a set of instructions on how Russian propaganda is supposed to sum up 2022. Now, this is a pretty significant thing to trust in, but in my experience, Meduza has tended to be fairly reliable, and I do trust them on most things. So here are a few takeaways that are worth mentioning in my opinion. First, they are supposed to describe Kherson and Zaporozhye as part of Russia and successfully annexed, despite Russia not controlling the vast majority of these territories, including the namesake capital city. Unsurprisingly, it also instructs the readers to focus on the fact that Russia is not at war with Ukraine, but with NATO and the United States. And finally, it claims that the economic situation in Russia will continue to improve. Now, not only is that highly unlikely, but it also implies incorrectly that the situation is improving now, which it is not. And the final thing that I want to address is the fact that these instructions exist at all, which is probably more surprising than it sounds. Generally, the propaganda machine isn't directed from on high, aside from on specific, very touchy topics. Things like this are usually left to its own devices, and it will kind of intuit or guess at what it can and should say, and what things are almost off limits. And in circumstances where it's deemed important and the path forward is unclear, whoever's in charge of this particular outlet, Konstantin Ernst is the one who comes to mind for me right now, is what I can think of, might look to the Kremlin for guidance or permission on what to do next and how coverage should proceed, but generally, the propaganda machine is self-correcting and self-directing, and it is interesting that we are seeing over the course of this war, it is becoming less willing to take risks, and it is receiving more direct guidance from the Kremlin. And finally, I'm going to do something that I don't think I've done before, and I'm going to recommend a specific article that I think is probably worth reading for anybody with an interest in the subject. It's titled, "Putin, Unaccustomed to Losing, is Increasingly Isolated as the War Falters." It's in the Washington Post, and it's by Catherine Belton. Fairly long for a news article, absolutely worth reading. As I mentioned earlier, it's by Catherine Belton. She's great. Her book on Russia is amazing, and we'll talk about that soon. It also draws heavily on the writing of Tatiana Stanovaya, who in my opinion is one of the best commentators on Russia and Russian internal politics right now. That is where we are going to end our 13th weekly segment. This is January 2nd of 2023, and thank you for listening.